They told you the basement was enough. They told you the storm cellar was a relic, replaced by weather apps and emergency broadcast systems that would warn you in time. They told you that your grandfather's instincts about the sky were superstition, that his rituals before a storm were the habits of an uneducated man who didn't know better. But your grandfather survived tornadoes that would have killed a man who trusted only his smartphone. He survived them because he understood something that no FEMA pamphlet will ever teach you. The land speaks before the storm arrives, and the people who listened to it built systems, shelters, and habits that saved entire families for generations. Those systems were not erased because they stopped working. They were quietly set aside because prepared, independent people are not profitable customers. Mas, this is not a story about fear. This is a story about reclaimed knowledge, about the precise and practical wisdom of people who had no choice but to be right the first time. We will walk through 25 techniques, habits, and constructions that your grandparents used, that modern emergency management has largely ignored, and that remain as physically valid today as the day they were first practiced. Some of them will surprise you. A few of them exist in legal gray areas depending on your county. All of them work. 25. The animal barometer. Before Doppler radar existed, farm families kept close watch on their livestock not as a romantic countryside habit, but as a functional early warning system. Cattle that clustered together and refuse to graze. Hogs that become agitated and press against fence lines. Dogs that dig low into the ground without command. These behaviors are responses to infrasound, to drops in barometric pressure, and to electromagnetic changes that precede tornado-producing supercells by as much as 2 to 3 hours. A 2013 study from the University of Colorado confirmed measurable behavioral changes in domestic animals up to 45 minutes before severe weather events detectable by radar. Your great-grandmother knew this without the study. She watched the chickens and she moved the family. 24. The wind-reading fence post. Experienced plains farmers drove a single tall post into open ground away from tree lines, then hung a long strip of light fabric from its top. In the hours before a tornado outbreak, the behavior of that fabric, specifically its tendency to hang limp and then rotate in slow eddies rather than stream consistently in one direction, indicated the rotational instability of surface winds. Modern meteorology calls this backing wind, a well-documented precursor to supercell formation. Your grandfather called it the sign to stop plowing and start preparing. The post cost nothing. The knowledge was passed down at dinner tables, and it was never regulated away, only forgotten. 23. The hardened door frame brace. In the era before poured concrete construction dominated residential building, farmhouses were timber-framed structures where the interior door frames, particularly those running perpendicular to the likely storm track, were the strongest load-bearing elements in the building. Grandparents taught their children to stand braced in these frames, not as a superstition, but as structural logic. The triangle of force created by a proper mortise and tenon door frame in a balloon-framed house can resist lateral loads that would collapse an adjacent wall. Modern drywall construction has eliminated this advantage entirely, which is why emergency management agencies stopped recommending door frames as shelter. The technique was not wrong. The architecture changed. 22. The root cellar as pressure refuge. The original American root cellar, dug 4 to 6 feet into undisturbed earth and covered with a thick earthen berm, was not primarily a food storage solution. It was a pressure equalization chamber. The physics are straightforward. A tornado's damage is caused not only by wind force, but by the catastrophic pressure differential between the interior of the funnel and the surrounding air. A below-grade structure with a properly weighted double-hatch entry eliminates that differential entirely. FEMA's own published safe room standards quietly confirm this physics. The difference is that your grandfather built his with hand tools and native stone, while modern guidance steers you toward a $20,000 poured concrete module that requires a licensed contractor and a building permit. 21. The storm approach compass direction. Experienced tornado country families knew that the most dangerous position relative to an approaching storm was northeast of its track, not directly in its path. Tornadoes in the northern hemisphere are embedded in supercell thunderstorms that travel predominantly northeast, and the most violent winds wrap around the northeast quadrant of the mesocyclone. Plains families positioned themselves consistently to the southeast when shelter was unavailable, dropping into drainage ditches below grade level and covering themselves with heavy blankets or canvas. This is documented behavior in survivor accounts from the 1925 Tri-State tornado, the deadliest in recorded American history, where those who moved southeast of the track had measurably higher survival rates. No agency teaches this with the clarity it deserves. 20. The stacked stone windbreak. Farmers in tornado-prone regions built low, dense windbreaks of stacked fieldstone on the southwestern exposures of their properties, not merely to protect crops, but to disrupt the surface flow of rotating winds before they could fully organize against a structure. Modern aerodynamic research on ground-level wind disruption confirms that even a 2-foot stone barrier can reduce surface wind speed by 15 to 30% within a protected zone behind it. These structures required no permits because they predated zoning law, and they served double duty as property boundaries and livestock barriers. They have been replaced by nothing. 19. The canvas storm collar. Before manufactured door seals and weather stripping, farm families kept heavy waxed canvas panels specifically for storm preparation. These were fixed across window openings and door gaps using a system of wooden battens wedged into the frame. The canvas absorbed and distributed wind pressure rather than resisting it rigidly, reducing the likelihood of a window failure that could equalize interior pressure catastrophically. A modern version of this technique, using marine-grade canvas and wooden dowels, costs less than $40 to prepare for an entire house and can be deployed in under 8 minutes. No building code requires it. No home improvement retailer markets it. 18. The cistern as storm anchor. Buried water cisterns made of stone or brick, common on farmsteads through the mid-20th century, had a structural secondary function that their owners understood intuitively. The mass of water contained in an in-ground cistern, typically 3,000 to 10,000 gallons, knew stabilize the surrounding soil against the uplift forces that tornadoes apply to shallow foundations. Families who built their storm shelters adjacent to or partially incorporating the cistern structure were adding tens of thousands of pounds of anchoring mass to their refuge. This is applied physics that required no engineering degree to understand. It required only the accumulated experience of people who had watched what tornadoes did to the earth and drawn logical conclusions. 17. The triangulated fence shelter. Open country families caught in fields without access to a cellar would construct impromptu shelters by pressing themselves into the leeward corner of a woven wire fence line that met at an angle, covering themselves with heavy coats or canvas, and gripping the lowest wire strand to prevent uplift. The woven wire fence, if properly anchored with wooden corner posts set 3 feet deep, can resist lateral wind loads far exceeding those of a temporary structure. The technique is documented in Red Cross disaster reports from the 1930s. It is not taught today because it conflicts with the simpler message of seek shelter immediately, a message that is accurate but incomplete for the reality of people caught in the open. 16. The pressure equalizing vent. Before modern construction sealed buildings into rigid pressure vessels, Farmhouse attics were ventilated with large, operable louvers on the gable ends. Before a known storm, these louvers were opened fully, not to air the attic, but to allow pressure to pass through the attic space rather than build against the roof deck. A roof fails in a tornado primarily from internal pressure buildup after a window or door breaches. A freely ventilating attic reduces this risk significantly. Modern energy codes have largely sealed attic spaces for insulation efficiency, removing this passive protection. The insulation saves you money on heating. It costs you resilience in a storm. 15. The buried signal stone. Farm families who worked large properties placed distinctive flat stones at specific intervals to mark the safest path to the storm cellar across an open field in conditions of zero visibility. These were not random markers. They were spaced at a distance a person could cover in 3 to 4 running steps, set flush with the ground to prevent tripping, and oriented with a beveled edge pointing toward the cellar entrance. The system allowed a family member to navigate to shelter in complete darkness or in the wall cloud precipitation that precedes a tornado. It is a tactile navigation system of total elegance that requires no power, no battery, and no signal. 14. The hay bale interior barrier. Inside stone or timber storm shelters, families often constructed an inner wall of tightly stacked hay bales against the most exposed face of the structure. Compressed hay has remarkable impact absorption properties, documented in modern agricultural safety literature as a barrier material. A wall of hay bales 18 inches deep will absorb debris impact that would perforate a standard interior wall. It also provides insulation against the sudden temperature drop that accompanies a tornado's passage. After the storm, it feeds the livestock. Nothing about this technique has become less true. 13. The sealed jar atmospheric indicator. Glass canning jars partially filled with water and sealed during fair weather were used as crude but functional barometers on farmsteads. A visible meniscus depression in the water surface indicated rising atmospheric pressure. A convex rise indicated falling pressure. Experienced farm women tracked these jars over 24-hour periods and could identify pressure drops consistent with approaching severe weather before the sky showed any visible change. The technique has a scientific basis in the direct relationship between atmospheric pressure and the water surface shape in a sealed vessel. It was replaced by plastic weather stations manufactured overseas and sold for $30 that require batteries and break within 2 seasons. 12. The directional tree canopy red. Experienced observers on the plains learned to read the exposed undersides of tree leaves as a wind shift indicator. Many broadleaf trees, including cottonwood and silver maple, display their leaf undersides when the lower level wind direction reverses ahead of an approaching storm system. A phenomenon well documented in agrarian weather folklore and confirmed by basic leaf anatomy and aerodynamics. This is not mysticism. This is pattern recognition refined over generations of watching what preceded disaster and what preceded ordinary rain. The distinction matters enormously when you are deciding whether to return to the field or head for cover. 11. The weighted storm shutter. Traditional wooden storm shutters were not decorative. They were built with lead weights embedded in their lower rails to ensure they hung flush against window frames under high wind conditions rather than catching wind and tearing away. The weighting system also prevented the shutter from being drawn away from the frame by the negative pressure on the leeward side of the building during high winds. Modern decorative shutters are attached for aesthetics and will fail in conditions a weighted traditional shutter would survive. The original engineering was correct. The modern version is theater. 10. The smoke behavioral indicator. Chimney smoke behavior was read by generations of farm families as a precise atmospheric indicator. Smoke that descended or hugged the ground after rising a short distance indicated a strong temperature inversion and rapidly falling surface pressure, both consistent with pre-storm atmospheric conditions. Smoke that rose sharply and dispersed immediately indicated stable high pressure. This technique was described in detail in the 1889 edition of the U.S. Signal Corps' Weather Bureau Manual for Rural Observers, and was considered a reliable supplemental indicator by the agency's own trained staff. The knowledge was not classified. It was simply never transferred to the generations that inherited gas furnaces. 9. The underground water line as foundation anchor. Farmsteads with deep, stone-lined wells adjacent to their main structures benefited from an unplanned but real structural advantage. The well casing, extending 8 to 20 feet into consolidated earth, provided a passive anchor point against rotational uplift. Families who understood this placed their interior shelter spaces in the quadrant of the house closest to the well structure. This is applied geotechnical logic, not superstition, and the physics of soil anchoring under dynamic loading confirm the principle. 8. The dried herb respiratory protection. Farm families stored bundles of dried herbs, particularly mullein, eucalyptus, and yarrow, in storm shelters not for their scent, but for their respiratory protective properties in confined spaces where wood debris dust, soil particles, and animal matter would circulate after a storm's passage. Modern research on mullein's expectorant properties and eucalyptus oil's documented efficacy as a mucous membrane protectant validates this practice. A cloth dampened with eucalyptus and pressed over the face during post-storm debris management is more immediately accessible than a respirator that was not stored in the shelter. 7. The water barrel's storm weight. Families placed large filled barrels against interior partition walls on the lowest floor before a known storm. The mass served two purposes: to resist the lateral racking of wall panels under wind load, and to provide immediate freshwater access after a storm that might contaminate surface wells. A 40-gallon barrel weighs over 300 pounds when full. 3 of them braced against an interior wall. Load-bearing partition changes the dynamic behavior of that wall under lateral stress in ways that modern engineering can precisely calculate and validate. 6. The sound locating technique. Experienced tornado survivors documented a consistent pre-tornado auditory signature. A cessation of insect and bird sound, followed by a low, continuous roar, described variously as a freight train, a waterfall, or a sustained low note. Farm families trained their children to recognize this sound pattern as an absolute action trigger, rather than a signal to observe or confirm.
You just have to know how
The elimination of environmental sound by the electromagnetic and pressure fields of an approaching mesocyclone is a documented phenomenon. Modern people, habituated to artificial noise environments, have lost the baseline silence necessary to detect this change. 5. The hand-dug lateral escape tunnel. Substantial storm cellars on established homesteads often included a secondary exit, a short lateral tunnel emerging 8 to 10 feet from the main hatch, or covered by a flat stone or wooden trapdoor. This exit addressed the primary danger of a cellar without secondary egress: debris falling across the main hatch and trapping survivors underground. The lateral tunnel emerged at the surface below grade level, in a slight depression that itself provided protection against the initial surge. The engineering required only a shovel and the knowledge that 2 exits are always better than 1. 4. The oriented shelter placement. Plains homesteaders consistently placed storm cellars to the north or northeast of the main house, never directly beneath it. This placement addressed 2 realities: the statistical predominance of southwest to northeast storm tracks across the American interior, which meant a shelter northeast of the house was most likely downtrack and downwind of the main debris field, and the danger of the house structure itself collapsing into a cellar located directly beneath it. Modern manufactured storm shelters installed in garage floors violate this principle routinely. 3. The family storm drill. Before any technology existed to formalize emergency drills, farm families conducted seasonal rehearsals of their storm response that were as precise and repeated as any military procedure. Each family member had a specific role, a specific path, and a specific time limit. The family did not run to the cellar together. They ran in a sequence that moved the most vulnerable first, while the most capable secured what could be quickly secured. This choreography was rehearsed until it was reflexive. No app replicates this. No weather radio replaces it. The drill is the technology. 2. The generational knowledge transfer. Every technique in this account was preserved not in books, but in conversation, in the deliberate act of bringing a child to stand beside an adult and watch and ask and practice. The most sophisticated survival technology that your grandparents possessed was the habit of treating practical knowledge as sacred inheritance that must be passed by hand and by voice before it could be considered truly owned. When that habit of transmission broke, when television replaced the porch and the suburb replaced the farmstead, the knowledge did not retire. It was simply no longer invited to the table. 1. The sovereignty of preparation. Every one of these 24 techniques leads here to the understanding that the prepared person is not a frightened person, but a free person. Your grandfather did not rehearse the path to the storm cellar because he was afraid of storms. He rehearsed it because he refused to let a storm make his decisions for him. The act of preparation is an act of authority over your own life and the lives of those you are responsible for. It requires no subscription, no permit, no approval from an agency that will not be standing in your field when the sky turns green. It requires only the willingness to learn what was already known, to practice what your blood already remembers, and to treat the knowledge of your ancestors not as nostalgia, but as the most practical inheritance you were ever offered. Pick one of these this week, just one. Walk your property and find the southwest corner. Dig a shallow test trench and understand your soil. Watch how your animals behave at dusk. Begin the reclamation. It starts smaller than you think, and it builds into something your grandchildren will one day call survival knowledge. Because that is what it always was.